The Department of Records in the Jeffersonville, Indiana courthouse is unlike the record archives found in other courthouses in the area. Jeffersonville still allows public access to all of their record books. Just 10 miles away in New Albany, for instance, the courthouse keeps their archives in a storage facility without immediate public availability. Access is only granted if the requester has a specific case number. For researchers like me who are attempting to piece together unknown history, it makes finding anything impossible. If the history is unknown, then the case numbers are also unknown. In my personal experience, the departments of records in courthouses in southern Indiana and Louisville, Kentucky, were very unhelpful in providing any means to find a case number for historical research purposes. It's difficult because the records are mostly handwritten and cannot be searched by software programs. At the Jeffersonville Courthouse, however, a person can freely walk into the building and browse the stacks of books, open any record book and read, take pictures, or write down notes. Records are stored in neatly organized rows about 15 books high. They are organized chronologically from the early 1800s until recent years when Indiana legal records transitioned from paper to digital storage. At first, I was overwhelmed by the amount of information available to me, and I had no idea where to begin. There were marriage licenses, divorce dockets, civil lawsuits, criminal trials, and more. It would take a lifetime to read through everything in these books that interested me. These books were written in real time as each case came in, without knowing which cases or names would come later, so indexing them was impossible. Names were written as they came into the courts. Names were not alphabetized, and indexes are scattered throughout the list of people in random order. Worse, they're written in cursive, sometimes by people with very poor handwriting. Cases are added in order by date of hearing, not by case number, and were not in the name index in the front. To find a case, you literally must hunt through the pages, one by one, until you find a case number in the front of the book. Many times, this painful exercise offered very little value towards research, though some of the records I found offered some small pieces of the puzzle. For instance, searching through the archives might yield a tiny historical fact, such as finding the prophet's brother divorcing Hope Brumbach's sister Charlotte, which could have easily been found in one of the genealogy websites. But finding the record in the courthouse, along with the notes taken and the log of events for each case, did offer some value. Learning more about Melvin and Charlotte's divorce did give me some insight into the prophet's personal life. In the message, divorce and remarriage was a very touchy subject. Each pastor had a different opinion on what they felt the prophet permitted and what he rejected. Most message pastors were very strict towards the women in the religion, while being somewhat lenient with the men. If you were female and divorced your husband, you were forced to be single until the day of your death. Some pastors claimed that a divorced female could only join in the rapture if their husband took them back. Some took this further to say that a divorced woman could only be a servant once in heaven. Other pastors in the message taught the general fundamentalist Christian views on divorce and remarriage. Men and women, equally, were not permitted to remarry after divorce unless their spouse died. Still others taught that men could remarry, but women could not, regardless of whether their spouse was alive. Each pastor who differed and held a slight variation of opinion claimed that their version was exactly what the prophet taught. Even while in the message, I noticed that some of these opinions varied among those who learned from the prophet's actions, and they were vastly different from those who learned from the prophet's sermons. My grandfather, for instance, taught his church that marriage and divorce was a mystery, and that if the prophet had not preached the sermon with that title, the church would have never known what God wanted. I always wondered, why was that necessary when we had the Bible? If the prophet's actions in later years did not align with his sermons, What of his early years? I knew that this was one subject that could offer some insight into the prophet's personal life, and that it might give a glimpse into the difference between the views of the prophet's stage personas. If the message pastors were not wrong in their opinion of what the prophet taught, even if they were polar opposite in their own opinions, then the prophet must have had conflicting doctrines in his sermons. I had seen the differences in the transcripts, and I had listened to them on multiple occasions using the recordings that we could access. In some instances, the prophet did not permit remarriage after divorce until the death of a spouse. He said, "Your vow is unto death you separate, and there's nothing in this world that will permit you to marry, in the Bible, until your companion is dead." That's right. They're only grounds. There is no remarrying nowhere at all except a dead companion. In other instances, there were circumstances in which remarriage after divorce was permitted. Usually, those circumstances were only valid if the person seeking remarriage was male. In some cases, the conflicting doctrines were only a few months apart. For example, he said, "See, she's got a living husband, so no man could marry her. Care what she does and who she is, if she's got a living husband, there is no grounds for her at all. But it's not for him. Cause is her, not him. Get it? You have to make the word run in continuity. See, nothing saying he couldn't, but she can't. See, cause is her, not him. That's exactly what the Bible says. Cause is her. It is not stated against him to remarry, but her. Why? Christ is the type. Notice, it is stated that he cannot remarry only a virgin. He can remarry." Learning that the marriage between the prophet and his second wife was performed by a United Brethren minister during the time of the prophet's public affiliation with E. Howard Cadle, the man who introduced that denomination of faith to southern Indiana, I knew that the prophet would have been adopting the fundamentalist view on remarriage. Considering the criminal sex scandal of Roy E. Davis during his mentoring the prophet, I wasn't certain that those same views would have been present in his early ministry. Davis was living with an underage teenager, and if his criminal past were fully exposed, the prophet would have known that Davis had abandoned his first and second wives to live with the girl in his parsonage. The question was whether his affiliation with Cadle would have convinced the prophet's person and not simply contributed content for the stage persona. I found it interesting that the prophet never mentioned being affiliated with United Brethren in the sermons that we had access to hear. It was but one of many surprises I found while researching his 1941 marriage to Meta Broy. The marriage certificate between the prophet and Meta was the first official document in which the prophet claimed to have been born in 1909. On earlier documents, he claimed to have been born in 1908, while his parents believed that he was born in 1907. The 1909 birth year is significant to the version of the message movement that I grew up in. I wondered why he decided to change his birth year after working with E. Howard Cadle. Also, I wondered why he would choose United Brethren minister Carnie Carpenter to perform his wedding instead of his own Pentecostal assistant pastor. Reading through the United States Census documents, I discovered that the prophet and his son lived with his siblings after the 1937 flood, and that his brother Jesse worked at the casino. I knew that tracing Jesse's life would also lead to a good insight into the prophet's off-stage views. There were many sermons speaking about the sins of casinos and gambling. I found a marriage license for Jesse in the 1938 marriage license book at the courthouse. Jesse had divorced 3 months before the wedding of that same year, and the prophet performed the wedding of Jesse and Agnes Gullett. That marriage lasted only a few months, even though Jesse had a child with Agnes. A little over a year later, Jesse married Mary Merriman. Jesse falsely claimed on his marriage certificate to Mary that he had only been married once before, and the prophet signed it. The prophet had performed Jesse's third wedding, knowing that he had been divorced twice before. The Clark County Memorial Hospital sued Jesse for services provided for professional care for Mary. I wondered, was Jesse physically abusive? I was not able to find the divorce lawsuit transcripts. I was, however, able to find a record of Jesse Branham being arrested in 1945. As brawls broke out in resorts on Highway 62, 9 were arrested in the Woodview Inn. Henry Branham, the boxer and soon-to-be mistaken for faith healer, was also among those involved. Even more surprising, as I searched through the newspaper archives for the prophet's siblings and local acquaintances, I found that the prophet's brother Howard was still involved with the liquor industry, long after the healing campaigns began. During the early part of William Branham's ministry, Howard traveled with the prophet, both in the United States and abroad, as a faith-healing evangelist, and he is featured in many of the early photographs used for marketing and for Branham's newsletter, The Voice of Healing. Howard posed for many of the photographs with familiar faces, such as Gordon Lindsay, Ern Baxter, Jack Moore, and others. During this time, as early as March of 1948, Howard Branham remained actively brewing, promoting, and selling liquor. In 1948, he found himself at the center of legal issues as Robert Hutzel and Earl Neal filed an injunction against Paul Jacobs and Howard Branham's Beech Grove nightclub and dance hall. This continued as late as 1952. In March of 1952, Howard proudly advertised his tasty Irish Shillelagh, an Irish mixed drink, at his nightclub, the Galway Bay. Howard had partnered with Harold Stockoff and Kenneth Miller and invited everyone to greetings on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, with Bach beer. The 1965 sermon, Marriage and Divorce, is one of the most controversial sermons preached by the prophet. Many children in the message are required to listen to the prophet's instructions on the subject, including his misogynistic statements concerning women. Many parents force their adolescent girls to listen, as the prophet taught them to believe that they are capable of becoming morally lower in virtue than any hog, dog, or any other animal. In the creation theology presented in his sermon, the prophet claimed that they, as females, were designed by Satan himself. This sermon is used in some countries to defend their belief in polygamy. The prophet claimed that the Bible described a covenant of polygamy. According to my grandfather, the prophet explained his reason for preaching the sermon Marriage and Divorce to him privately. He claimed that before this sermon, message believers did not know that remarriage after divorce was forbidden. Therefore, God forgave specific men who remarried, as long as they didn't divorce and remarry again. The year before, it had been made public that the prophet's son was remarried after divorce, and the prophet claimed that it was after an annulment, not a divorce. It all seemed too coincidental to me, especially since the prophet said, "He could, but she can't," towards the end of his marriage and divorce sermon. I found the civil court docket for the separation in the records section of the courthouse. It was filed with action divorce, not annulment. Billy Paul Branham divorced Ollie Mae Christopher Branham on September 23, 1953. They were only married for about a month when Mae Branham filed for divorce. According to the court record, she filed the divorce suit through Jesse Branham. By this time, I realized that the prophet's life off stage did not match his words on stage. In many public sermons, the public figure would have been preaching against his own brother, who stood on the platform with him. But I was curious. What did the locals think about a Pentecostal minister performing weddings for the divorced and the re-divorced? I found an article in the Louisville, Kentucky newspaper describing the ministers in Jeffersonville and how they were creating a moral dilemma for Louisville churches. Jeffersonville, which was at that time a gambling town, was known throughout Kentucky and Indiana for easy marriages. According to Louisville's Judge Kirby, at least 90% of the divorcees in Louisville had been married in Jeffersonville. He urged legislators to consider laws to abolish easy marriages, or as some called them, quick marriages. Shortly after Jesse divorced his second wife, this law became a reality for citizens of Indiana. State legislators agreed that the problem in Jeffersonville was a threat to society. So in 1940, they passed a law that required waiting for a blood test. If the couple had a sexually transmitted disease, they were told no, and could not be married. This made me even more curious about the prophet performing Jesse's third marriage in 1941. Was the prophet helping Jesse bypass the health and legal system? If the prophet joined forces with E. Howard Cadle, it was only temporary. As far as I could tell, the Pentecostal Tabernacle never became a Cadle Tabernacle or Brethren Tabernacle. Instead, in 1945, it was renamed Branham Tabernacle. The very first mention of Branham Tabernacle was in the newspapers on October 13, 1945. I wondered, why did the name change? It was time to expand my research to a much larger scope of research. If the prophet was already connected to E. Howard Cadle and Fred Francis Bosworth, he was deeply involved with his faith-healing evangelistic campaigns. Yet in the message we were told that his gift of healing was not given to him until 1947. That's what the prophet said in his life story accounts. He said, "And a strange thing of that you might know, the very day the angel of the Lord called me out, May the 6th, 1947, and issued the gift to pray for the sick, was the very same day that Israel became a nation for the first time in 2,500 years. I knew it was time to start digging into the history of the prophet's ministry from 1945 to 1947. What happened during this timeline? Did he leave Pentecostalism? Did he become a United Brethren minister? Maybe, I thought, he became a Baptist minister and his life story accounts were partially accurate. Maybe he just failed to mention that he was a Pentecostal turned Baptist turned Pentecostal. The many links to the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacy, and African American exclusion through multiple people involved with the prophet's early ministry were too many to ignore. I thought, if the prophet was rebranding his tabernacle name to his own name, he was preparing for the second phase of a much bigger plan. What was that plan? How did it fit with E. Howard Cadle and the Indiana Klan? How did it fit with Roy E. Davis and the Georgia Klan? And what was Roy Davis doing after being extradited to Arkansas before reconnecting with William Branham? I needed to search the missing timeline, and I knew it would not be easy. The prophet said that his gift of healing came in May of 1947, yet the earliest transcripts of healing campaigns were dated April 1947, before his gift was supposed to have been given. The first transcripts mentioned new gadgets for recording, implying that there were old gadgets, and we had no access to a single sermon by these old gadgets. Where did they go?